where Professor Pete shares his screen. So you'll just have a strip it down the side of your screen. If you've got questions for Professor, can you please pop them into the chat box? So it's usually along the bottom of your screen on a computer. I think you find it up at the top on an iPad. There's a chat box, and if you can pop your questions into that as you go along, you can type them in at any time. But what we'll do when he's finished speaking is we'll go back through the questions one by one at that point, but rather than keep stopping and starting. Okay. So I think I'm just going to hand over to Scott, if that's okay, Scott.
Yes, fine. Thank you, Judith. A very warm welcome to all of you, and a huge thank you to Professor Pete Smith and to Eco Congregation Scotland, the network, for being our co-host. Tonight is really a follow-on from, or not so much a follow-on, a replacement for an event we'd hoped to have during Aberdeen Climate Week back in the spring before the pandemic arrived and kind of scotched our plans. Obviously, we wanted to have this event because we're concerned, like many people, about climate change. For us as people of faith, that springs from our sense of the value of life in the created world, but we're glad to work with so many other people in our city and beyond who come also from a non-faith perspective, but for whom this is also a critical and important issue. And I think the pandemic has only gone on to make us think about our lives, about the sustainability of our lives, and actually whether there's an opportunity following lockdown to rebuild our economy and indeed our society in a more climate-friendly and environmentally just way. So delighted to bring everybody together. Thanks so much to the network for hosting, and I'd love to introduce Professor Pete Smith, who's our speaker for tonight.
Thanks very much, Scott. So I'll try to share my screen now. So you will see a difference. There you go. Can you see my screen?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now it won't change, so I'm going to go back in and do that again. There. That's good. Can you see that screen?
Yes.
Right. Okay, I'll begin. So I want to That's muted me now. Right, but now you're unmuted and I'm not. So I'm going to talk tonight about the climate emergency, but I'm going to talk about it from a personal perspective about what we can do about it. I work in climate change science, and a lot of the things that I look at are things like how the agricultural sector can decarbonise, how the government can introduce new policies to change the way that we travel and things like that. But people often perceive this as very passive. They sort of say, yeah, okay, we want to do something about it, but we have to rely on the governments to make a change. And whilst the governments have a responsibility to provide the enabling conditions in which we can make a change, it's actually us, the 7.7 billion people living on the planet, that are using fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases. So we all have some responsibility in emitting greenhouse gases and in causing climate change. So tonight I'm going to talk about some of the things that we as individuals can do about it. I'm going to start off with an introduction about climate change, what it is and what it does. But then I'm going to move into the space about what we as individuals can do. And now I can't change the slides again. I'm going to go out and come back in. technical hitches. Can you see the screen again? Great. And now I can change. So climate change has been in the news a great deal recently, and there's no accident that Greta Thunberg has brought this message. Many people in the press like her all over, but she's really put this, and the school strikes movement has really put climate change front and centre of press coverage and of the news. There are also groups like Extinction Rebellion that have moved the agenda in terms of people talking about climate change, and whether you like their methods or not, it has moved it up the agenda and it's got more people talking about climate change. But I think the school strikes for climate has been the main one, and the people that have engaged with that, with World Climate Day and things like that, have really raised the profile. So the effects of climate change are extremely damaging. So you might say, living in Scotland, we don't mind a bit of climate change. It would be nice to have a background like the one that I've got today with palm trees in the background. And if that was 2050, we'd all be quite happy. But it's not quite as simple as that, because there are massive changes that are occurring around the world, which disproportionately affect those that are least able to respond to them. So if you just look at this map that's shown, you can see this map was made in 2014, but you can see there the risk of wildfire in Australia is shown there. So it was way before the actual wildfires occurred in Australia and California, but they duly happened last year, at the end of last year, and have burned large areas of land. There's the crop changes that we see in crop failures around the world. There are water shortages that we see in many places. The melting ice and the polar ice caps is a significant problem. And as we see periodically, especially during the winter and the spring, we've seen floods and rising sea levels. So there are a number of these hotspots around the world, but a number of really, really dangerous and things that will completely change our way of life, particularly for those that are less able to deal with it. So you'll see there that the number of threats in the tropical regions in sub-Saharan Africa, South America, South Asia and Southeast Asia are disproportionate to those that we see in the global north. So climate change impacts. There are a number of climate change impacts. There are more frequent and stronger heat waves that are projected. So this is NASA data. More storms, more floods, more droughts, more famines. All of those cause economic and environmental issues, as well as a lot of human suffering. We could be looking at up to a 1 metre sea level rise by 2100. So that's in a really short period of time. We're only talking about 80 years away, and we could see a 1 metre rise in sea level in that time. And I live in the coast. I live in a little coastal village, and that would be devastating for the little coastal village in which I live. There are also more pests and diseases and extreme events such as the floods and the droughts and the heat waves also cause further crop failures. So those pests and diseases that are affecting our crops will also affect food security. And we're also expecting an ice-free Arctic in the summer before the mid-century. So before we get to 2050, we could be seeing an ice-free Arctic, and that's never happened within the last few centuries at least. So why is this happening? This is happening because the global temperatures are increasing, and I'll come on to why that is in a minute. But we used to 10 years ago have the debates about, is climate change real, is it happening, and is it caused by humans? But there's really no longer any doubt that it's happening and that it's caused by humans. I've got a couple of slides to show that. This is just the data taken relative to the long-term average, and it's just plotted here there from 1860, round about the end of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, up to 2020, and you can see that there are the graph on the left, towards the left of the graph, is much lower than the right of the graph. So we're actually seeing temperatures increasing year on year. Another way to look at it is to look at the temperature anomaly. So if we look at the the temperature anomaly relative to the long-term average. We can show areas that are cooler than long-term average in blue, and areas that are higher than the long-term average in warm colours in yellow or red. I'll just show a little animation of the temperature analogy, and you'll see from the top that this is beginning in 1880. So we're going to move this forward at intervals through to the present time. So what you're looking for here is look to see if the map is getting more blue or more red. What you see here in about 1880 is that some areas are getting a little bit warmer, but there's some areas are getting significantly colder. So through the early 1900s, we're really not seeing any pattern there. We're seeing changes that occur. Maybe the Arctic is a little cooler, and there are some areas that are getting warmer, but we don't see any real trend. Moving forward through the 1930s, there's a slight warming through the Second World War, but that largely disappears by the middle of the 1940s and 1950s. You'll see a big change starting to occur from the 1960s and 1970s onwards. So when it's getting hotter, you'll see that it starts to get warmer colours. So we're moving through 1974 now, 1975, 76, it's starting to warm up. We're now heading through the 1980s. You can see a big heat there over the north and over the southern regions. We're into the 1990s now, and now there's absolutely no doubt at all that we're seeing global warming. So relative to that long-term average, we've got a really, really significant change. So this data stops in 2018. But what you can see there, relative to the planet that we had before, we've got a significantly warmed planet with many areas that are above 3 degrees above the long-term average. And of course, daily and weekly fluctuations way beyond that. So there's really no doubt that climate change is occurring. And just in case you want another way of looking at that, here's another slide. This is just stacking up all of the years from 1860 through to the present time and comparing them against that long-term average. So again, this is showing each year is shown as a colour with where it is in relation to the long-term average. And you can ask which end is bluer and which end is redder. And you can see that as we approach the present, we get into the significant climate warming in that red zone. And that is increasing as we go further on. So it's increasing at a greater rate as we get closer to the present. So climate change is warming. So there's no real doubt about that. And the reason that it's warming is through changes in greenhouse gas concentrations. On this graph, you can see the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere taken at the Mauna Loa laboratory in Hawaii. It's recorded there because it's a long way away from land masses, and it gets a good, it's high up, so it gets a good measure of the CO2 in the atmosphere. First thing to notice is that you can see that it's a sawtooth. So since measurements started being taken, you can see this sawtooth effect, where you get an increase in the summer in the summer in the northern hemisphere and a decrease in the northern hemisphere winter. That's because there's more land in the northern hemisphere, and the carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere by plants when they grow. So when we see plants growing, they're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and when they die back in the winter, they're releasing that CO2 back. And that's what gives us this sawtooth effect on the graph. So we're actually seeing the Earth breathing here. But what you can also see is this trend in the carbon dioxide concentrations. We've gone from about 310 parts per million in 1960 up to above 400 parts per million in just that short time since 1960. So in 2020, we're above 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and that is now constantly above it. Even though you've got that sawtooth going up and down, we're rising, those carbon dioxide concentrations are rising inexorably. The problem with those increasing levels of CO2 is that carbon dioxide traps the heat in the atmosphere. So it acts, it's called the greenhouse effect because the greenhouse gases act like a greenhouse gas. The light coming in from the sun passes through the atmosphere, but when it bounces off the surface of the Earth, It's at a different wavelength, and at that wavelength it is trapped. That heat is trapped in the atmosphere. So it's causing an increase in the global temperature. There are two other important greenhouse gases. I've just shown you the carbon dioxide concentration. Here it is plotted over 10,000 years, and you can see that it's relatively stable, maybe going up a little bit for the last 10,000 years. But then round about the time of the Industrial Revolution, you can see this little breakout graph here. You see a hockey stick where it increases greatly. And you can also see that same effect in methane over the past 10,000 years. We've got a fairly steady concentration, and then in the Industrial Revolution, that methane concentration spikes and increases rapidly. And the nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas, is sticking around. So there's a bit of bouncing around there during the last 10,000 years. But the Industrial Revolution, that starts to increase greatly. So we're increasing our greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, which then is causing climate warming. So the physics is known. There's really no doubt about the mechanism by which this occurs. The gases are increasing in the atmosphere, and it's causing climate change. That climate change is causing increasingly adverse effects on the planet. Under the Paris Agreement, there was an agreement to try to limit the warming that we see to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times, with an ambition to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's because the impacts of climate change get much more dangerous when you go above 1.5 through 2 degrees Celsius. And if we hit the sort of like 3 or 4 or 5 degrees Celsius rises, then we're into catastrophic failure of the Earth system. So we want to keep the global temperatures. It was agreed at the Paris Agreement in 2015, December 2015, that we would try to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times. The bad news is that since the Industrial Revolution, the global temperature have already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius. So it only gives us 0.4 degrees Celsius until we are exceeding that limit. If we look at the current rate of emissions, we will exceed that 1.5 degree target. We'll get that additional 0.4 degrees of warming within about 5 to 10 years. So these are estimates by the Met Office and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that's why we're into this territory of a climate emergency. We've got a few years to sort this out. We've got maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 12 years to limit this warming to a level that can be managed. So we're not talking about something that's going to happen in the future. We're talking about something that we have to address immediately and aggressively now. Globally, we currently emit 1,331 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every second. There's a little clock, just like there's a little clock on the internet where you can look at carbon emissions and you can just see that ticking away and those numbers ticking up really, really quickly. So over 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere every second. And the greenhouse gas emission reduction needs to be immediate and aggressive. If we're to maintain the climate within safe limits, we have to really get on top of this now. That's why the UK and Scotland and many other countries have declared a climate emergency, because there's a recognition that we're not moving fast enough. We're not moving in the right direction in some cases, but where we are, we're not moving fast enough. And we need to treat this as the emergency that it is. If we don't get on top of it within the next 5 to 10 years, we've missed the opportunity to limit climate warming to levels that would be safe for us to deal with. To tackle climate change, what we need to do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I mentioned the relationship between greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere and climate change, the rise in temperature. So what you can see at the top of this, graph is the business as usual emissions of greenhouse gases. So we're in 2020, the business as usual emissions will continue. They may peak at around about 2060 or 2070, and then they start to come down. That's going to leave us in big trouble. What we need to do is we need to get onto this red line, this trajectory that takes us below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's a massive change from business as usual. The gap between business as usual and below 2 degrees continues to grow until 2050. So we must start to turn this around really quickly. Emissions have to peak within the next year or two and then start to decline by about 3 to 4% per year, whereas in the past they've only ever gone up. So we have to make a big change. We can do that with these conventional abatement technologies shown in the blue. That's things like switching to non-carbon based energy, so decarbonising the grid, more solar, more wind, maybe more nuclear in the countries that have nuclear. But even then, we'll be left with a small amount of emitting technologies that are left in the mix. So by 2050, by 2100, we're still going to be emitting greenhouse gases. Agriculture, for example, emits greenhouse gases, and we've got to eat. So there are some issues there. So to deal with this, there's been the proposal for negative emissions. So this is taking carbon dioxide, actively taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere so that we offset the remaining emissions that are in the mix for 2100. So that can be anything from planting trees. Planting trees locks up carbon. As the trees grow, they lock the carbon into the wood, and then that carbon is stored for the duration of however long the trees are there. So it can be simple things like that. Soil carbon sequestration is another one. I work on soil carbon sequestration a lot. But we could also be using more technological solutions, such as direct air capture. But this costs a lot of energy and it costs a lot of money to do that at the moment. So we can't rely on that. So our options are really cutting our emissions, and with the remaining emissions that are going to remain in the mix, maybe from aviation and a bit from producing our food, we have to take emissions out of the atmosphere. So what are we doing about it in the UK and Scotland? Well, let's first look at where our emissions come from. This slide was made a few years ago, but it shows that the majority of our emissions come from electricity supply, 40%. That's going down all the time because we're investing heavily in renewables in this country. Transport accounts for about 21%, business 12%, 15%, agriculture 20%, residential 16%. And forestry, I don't know if you could see that, it's in the bottom corner, it's maybe behind the videos, but that's actually a negative number because forestry in Scotland is actually taking up carbon from the atmosphere. So that's a negative emission, if you like, a negative number. But industrial processes are only responsible for about 1%. So if we think that we're going to solve the issue just by saying, well, the government needs to sort out what industry is doing, that's not going to do it. If we look at the public sector, those aren't really big emissions, so it can't do it. So basically that leaves us, we're the people who live in places responsible for residential emissions. We are responsible for the transport emissions. We move ourselves around the country. The waste and also the business is so that we have a personal responsibility to do something about climate change. We've got legislation in place. It's world-leading legislation. I rarely compliment any government, including the Scottish government and the UK government. But there's one thing that the Scottish government and the UK government have got right, is they've got really aggressive climate change acts. So the Climate Change Act in the UK from 2008 and the Climate Change Act Scotland Act in 2009 set aggressive emission reduction targets of about 80% by 2050. After the Paris Agreement, it was realised that we have to up those targets. Even though they're a very ambitious target, we have to reach net zero by 2050. So the UK has got a 2050 target for net zero emissions. That means that we have to reduce our emissions to zero, effectively. We could maybe have some forestry and peatland restoration taking up some of those emissions, but our net emissions, the amount of emissions going out, the emissions coming in, have to be zero. And it was Scotland, it was felt, could do that more quickly. So Scotland now has a net zero emissions target by 2045. So this is world leading legislation. We are one of the few countries, New Zealand, some of the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, also have net zero targets, but those are relatively few compared to the number of countries on Earth. So we've got a commitment from government to do something about it. And they create the conditions in which business and we as individuals can reduce our emissions. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more now. So what can we do as individuals? The first thing is very relevant at the moment, given the COVID-19 lockdown, is that it's not one that I had on the slide until I revised these slides during lockdown. You can work from home if you can. Working from home greatly decreases the amount of road miles that we do. It also, you could argue, reduces the amount of travel wear and tear and stress that we have to deal with. But if you can work from home, that would greatly reduce the amount of travel that we need to do, particularly private travel. And it's been estimated that the amount of people working from home, because people have got used to it and they're doing things by Zoom or Teams now, we don't need to be in work all of the time. We can do a lot of it from home. That could maybe increase by 550% after UK lockdown lifts. So that's shown us an example of a way that we can avoid our travel emissions by working from home more regularly. When we do go back to work, and this is something else that's been affected by COVID, we should take public transport wherever possible or car share. COVID has shown us that that's not always possible. There's been actually a rebound in the amount of private car use instead of public transport, because people have been scared to go back on public transport or discouraged from doing so. So people are driving around in individual cars more. So that's one effect that COVID has had that's pushed us in the wrong direction. We can also fly less or not at all. So we know from looking at the figures on global emissions, we've quantified those, and there was an emissions drop of 17% in emissions. That's absolutely unprecedented. As I've said, they've gone up year on year. But now that rebound has happened and we're back to just a 5% reduction compared to normal emissions for this time of year. So as countries have successively come out of lockdown, we've seen a return to business as usual, despite the opportunities we have to change the way that we live. The next one is to eat less meat and dairy, and I've got a few slides on that later because I know that's controversial. So I'll just show you why that can have a real significant impact on your greenhouse gas emissions. Meat and dairy are responsible for a large amount of our personal greenhouse gas footprint. Obviously, don't buy stuff you don't need. We live in a very consumerist society where our economy is based on the fact that we go and buy stuff. We probably are encouraged to buy loads of stuff that we don't need, to not reuse things, not mend them, to not wear old clothes and go to charity shops. That's good for the economy, but it's bad for the environment. Use less energy and insulate homes. Insulating homes is a no-brainer. It really saves money. It improves people's livelihoods. It makes them warmer in the winter. And it's a relatively low-cost thing to do. So that will be one thing that the government could do to help us. It could provide home insulation for free, or it could at least subsidise it to a certain extent, as it did with the loft insulation a few years ago. We can move to renewable heating to heat our homes. If you live in a rural community, as some of us do, you're off the gas network and you're using oil. You can replace that with a ground source heat pump, for example, and wean ourselves slowly off fossil fuels. That increases your electricity use a bit more, but it reduces the amount of fossil fuels that we use because the electricity can be generated from renewables. Whenever possible, you can purchase low greenhouse gas alternatives. I think it will only be a few years before carbon labelling comes in on consumer goods. In the same way as you have energy stickers on a fridge, when you go and buy a new fridge or a new cooker, you can see its efficiency rating, A+ or A or B or C. And I think that we need to have that sort of labelling on foods and other products that we buy. And finally, we can create some carbon sinks. So planting trees is one example of that. We as a community, the little community that I live in, Colliston in the northeast of Scotland, we're making efforts to plant community woodland to try and offset some of the emissions from our commute. So I'll just give you a few slides now, just a few examples of some of the things that I've done, just to give you an example. There's lots of things you could do. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to do the right thing. So I'll just give you a few examples of things that we've done in our house to try and put my money where my mouth is, basically. The first thing that you can do is buy an energy meter. This is something that's just, that you can buy them in Tesco's. I think we got ours in Tesco's. It's quite cheap. And a little wire goes around the electricity just near your fuse box, and it tells you how much energy you're using at any one time. That was really important for us because it showed us what the most energy intensive things were. You find that with energy efficient light bulbs, leaving a light bulb on is no longer the crime that it used to be. I used to be told off as a kid for leaving the light on when it wasn't needed. But actually, you see, when you switch a light bulb on or off, it doesn't really make any difference. But when you go to put the kettle on, you see a big spike because that's about 3 kilowatts of energy being used whilst you're boiling the kettle. And if you're getting older and forgetful like me, you go and boil the kettle, you walk away and do something else, you forget about it, you think, oh, I didn't make that cup of tea, you go back and you put the kettle on again and you reboil it. And all of those things are increasing your energy use. So these little energy meters are really a real useful way of seeing what's happening in your own household and how you can change your behaviour to reduce the energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. You can set these to show you the energy. You can even set it to show you the greenhouse gas emissions that you're emitting. So it's a great little devices. The second thing is that we obviously need to use active transport like cycling and walking, and we need to use public transport much more in the future when this COVID thing is finally over or under control. But electric cars are going to become the norm really quickly. So I think if I'd given this talk even 5 years ago and said we're all going to be driving around in electric cars in 10 years' time, people would have thought I was balmy. But I think that revolution is coming. The infrastructure and the technology is getting better all the time. The range is improving, the performance improving on these electric cars. This is a Nissan Leaf, just an example, but there are other electric cars out there, and that's something I think within 10 years' time we're going to be buying electric cars. At the moment, they're more expensive, so the government has to work on incentivizing us to make those purchases more attractive. And ultimately, it's going to be cheaper to have an electric car than it is going to have an internal combustion engine car. And another thing that we did, because we live off the mains grid, we had heating oil, domestic heating oil, which was running a boiler. When the boiler started to get old and needed replacing, we thought we'll try to do something about it. We'll replace it with a ground source heat pump. So this works like a sort of a fridge in reverse. It takes heat out of the soil. So the temperature in the soil is about 9 degrees Celsius all year round. If you pump out a fluid, a refrigerated fluid, it's colder than the earth. It's colder than that 9 degrees earth. So you pump it out at maybe -4. So the heat is then transferred into the fluid that's been pumped under the ground. And then when it comes back into the house, you do a heat exchange, just like you do in a fridge. And you extract the heat from that and you pump that heat around to the radiators in your house or to heat your hot water. You then refrigerate that liquid and you pump it back around the garden so that it continually absorbs heat from under the ground. So it takes electricity to run the compressor, just like your fridge. If you listen to your fridge, it makes a noise when it's switched on. You hear a low sort of rumbling noise. That's the compressor working. And that's the same with a ground source heat pump. And it uses electricity to run them. But for every kilowatt of electricity that you put in, you get 4 kilowatts of heat energy back out. So it's still a good investment in terms of the heat energy. So this is the little paddock outside our house. We got a heat pump fitted in 2011. They dug up the paddock, which I didn't expect. I thought it was all going to be sort of fairly contained. But they put in this thing, and this has the heat being pumped out from the liquid being pumped out from the house. It goes in these smaller tubes all around the garden. It then comes back and it goes into this manifold and it's pumped back into the house. And in the house, you have this thing. This is a compressor, the heat exchanger. It looks like a submarine on the inside of the house now, whereas this used to be an empty boiler room. But the fluid comes in and there's a heat exchanger in here. This is what it looks like when it's finished and completed. It's not quite so ugly when it's completed, but that heat exchanger then pumps the heat around in the radiators and in the domestic hot water circuit here. We've got a big hot water tank that is also part of the system, because you have to hold on to that heat, and then you can store that heat in a larger reservoir. But that's what it looks like afterwards, after they dug it up. That picture of the manifold I showed you. This is it 6 months later when it's been. The manifold is under that, under this manhole cover there, but the rest of it is restored, and you can't see any of the underfloor, underground heating that's going on in the heat pump. But it uses a bit more electricity. So we decided that we also had to try to generate some electricity in our own house to try and offset that extra electricity that we're using to run the heat pump. So we're off fossil fuel, but our electricity bills were going up, and because the electricity is using fossil fuels, at least some of the fossil fuels, then we wanted to lower that too. So we decided to get some solar panels. Here they are going in. We got our ground-mounted solar panels because the house doesn't really face the right way. There's not enough roof space. So this is a 4 kilowatt system. It was put in. It looks like this when it's finished, again on that same piece of land that had the heat pump underneath. And that generates 4 kilowatts, maximum 4 kilowatts when it's a nice sunny day of electricity, which is being fed into the grid, fed into the house, so that we offset that electricity that we're using in the heat pump, and also for other domestic purposes. That's just a little picture of the close-up. It has a little inverter there, so that it goes into the house. And that's what it looks like from the garden. Not too bad. You can't see the heat pump. You can't see the solar panels, rather, so it's really not so ugly. But having said that, a friend of mine took a picture of it from the other side of the loch, and he sent me this. He photoshopped it and he sent me this. So that pylon isn't actually there. He photoshopped it on just to take the mick, because he thought that we looked like a small energy generating factory. So those are some things that you can do, and I recognise that those you have to have the capital to do that. Not everybody has the capacity to do that. Not everybody lives in a location. For example, if you live in a tenement or a block of flats, you don't have the possibility to do that. But for people living in rural locations, it is a possibility. We get paid for the money, we get paid for the units of energy that we generate, and we end up saving a lot of money on energy and on electricity from having a heat pump and solar panels. So you can actually save money, save electricity, and also that's better for the climate. The last thing that I'll talk about, because it's controversial, is we cause a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions from what we choose to eat. What we put in our plates 2 or 3 times a day really determines a lot about the greenhouse gases that we emit. And this is particularly the case with meat and dairy. So ruminant meat in particular, that's cattle and sheep, and dairy, of course, being milk. The reason for that is that of all of our greenhouse gas emissions, about 26% is directly due to the food that we produce. Agriculture is directly responsible for about 26% of the food. So that's a quarter of our emissions come from not energy and not transport, but a quarter of our emissions come from the food that we eat. Of those emissions, of those 25% of emissions, 26%, about 58% of all those emissions are from animal products. And that's despite the fact that animal products provide only a very tiny amount of our total nutrition. And of those 58% of animal products, 50% of those emissions come from beef and lamb. So that's the reason that sometimes it's mentioned, you know, that we need to cut meat and dairy to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. And the Committee on Climate Change Chief Executive, that's Chris Stark, told the BBC News that we can't meet the government's net zero target without major changes to the way that we use land and the way that we feed ourselves, what we eat. So this is something that's coming. It's an inconvenient truth that we need to reduce the amount of meat and dairy. We currently overconsume protein in Scotland and in the UK by about 50%. So there's no need to replace the protein that we don't eat with meat if we cut back on meat. There's no need to replace that with something else like insects or whatever. We can just reduce the amount of protein that we eat and the amount of meat without any major impact on our nutrition. But it's not just meat. There are things like out-of-season greenhouse-grown vegetables and things that are flown in from across the world that also have a high greenhouse gas intensity. But you can see here from this graph, which shows the greenhouse gas emissions from per unit of product. So this is a kilogram of product and a kilogram, the kilograms of CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions per kilogram of product. Over on the right-hand side are the vegetable-based products, a really, really low greenhouse gas intensity. And over on the left-hand side in red are the ruminant meats, and you can see that they have a 10 to 100 times greater greenhouse gas footprint per unit product than plant-based foods. So plant-based foods, if we can shift the amount of food that we eat in that red area over towards the blue area, we can have a real significant impact. And it's not just the greenhouse gases that we think about. So the ruminant meat has, as I said, a 10 to 100 times greater greenhouse gas footprint, but also the land, it has a 10 to 100 times greater land use associated with it. You need 10 times to 100 times more land to produce the equivalent kilogram of food. The energy use is also greater. The acidification potential and the eutrophication potential, these are measures of air quality and water quality. So that's also much worse from ruminant-based products. So it's between 10 and 100 times worse than the plant-based foods. So it's just about on all environmental metrics. It's something that we could consider doing if we want to reduce our environmental impact. So just coming back as a summary, these are the measures that I mentioned earlier. I'll just show them again. Work from home if you can. That obviously has social and equity issues associated with that. A recent study showed that if you split the population into the top 50% of earnings and the bottom 50% of earnings, the people in the top 50% of earnings, 90% of them can work at home. And if you split it, if you look at the bottom 50% of earnings, 90% of those people can't work from home. So there's also some social justice and equity issues associated with this. And I say blithely, work from home if you can, but that's a privilege that only the better paid among us generally have. Taking public transport and car sharing whenever we can, flying less or not at all, staycations or going on holiday in our beautiful country is a great way to do that, to avoid flying. Eat less meat and dairy, that one I've mentioned. If we don't buy stuff we don't need, use less energy, insulate our homes, move to renewable energy where that's possible, purchase low greenhouse gas alternatives, and if we're interested in creating carbon sinks, we could also get involved in planting community forestry and peatland restoration and volunteering in those sorts of sectors. So those are just a few of the things that we as individuals can do to help reduce their climate footprint. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention, and I'll take some questions. I've seen lots popping up in the chat box, so I think you've got lots of questions and I'll try to answer them.
You do have lots and lots of questions asked of you tonight. Can I just say thank you? That was absolutely fascinating. There's so much in that. The first question is from Marion Pallister, and it says, if the United States resumes nuclear testing as Trump has suggested, how dangerous would this be in climate emergency terms?
Sorry, the nuclear? Nuclear testing. Nuclear testing's a bad thing for the environment, but it doesn't really affect climate change. So nuclear testing's a dreadful thing for a number of reasons, but it doesn't emit greenhouse gases. It pollutes the environment with all sorts of other things, nasty radioactive isotopes and such like, but it's not really a climate thing, it's another environmental issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, I've got a few questions from Michael Wood, so I think we would just go with one of them to start. There's two actually that sit together that look quite similar, but maybe a little bit different. How can we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And can we ever really remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere?
Yeah, so there are a few ways of doing it. There's an excellent example in Iceland, which is called direct air capture. It uses a substrate called amines, which naturally absorbs CO2. So what you do is you pass CO2 over big filters, big reactors. The amine in those big reactors absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, and you can then take that CO2, liquefy it, and pump it down into the ground. And in Iceland, they have basalt rock. So basalt naturally mineralizes carbon dioxide. So you catch the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you pump it underground, and it mineralizes in the ground, in the basalt. So that's called direct air capture, and it uses waste heat energy from a hydrothermal power plant that they've got there. So there aren't many places that you can do this effectively, but there are some key places on Earth where it can be done. The costs are coming down. It started off at about $500 per ton of CO2 equivalents, but that's now come down to less than $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. So it's starting to get competitive in terms of removing carbon. But there are other things that you can do. As I mentioned, tree planting is something that you can do, removes carbon from the atmosphere, at least on a decadal basis. When we plant trees, they grow, and you can see the tree growing, obviously, over the years. It's not taking that biomass out of the ground, it's taking that out of the air. So that's carbon that was in the atmosphere goes into building that biomass in the tree. So planting trees is a good way of removing carbon from the atmosphere, as is peatland restoration, managing our soils better, and a few other land management based options for doing that.
Okay, thank you. Are you happy with that answer, Michael? Yeah. Okay, so there's another question here as well, which kind of goes along with these. If the UK could get to net zero, what would the effect that have on global emissions?
Not much. So we only emit about 1.7% of global emissions. So the reason for going net zero is because we're trying to persuade other countries to do that also. So we're only responsible for less than 2% of global emissions. But it's so it doesn't make a big difference. If we went carbon neutral and nobody else did, it would make virtually, it'd be a drop in the ocean, so it wouldn't be worth doing. But we're trying to persuade other countries to do that too. We're trying to persuade other countries to move towards net zero. So we have to really set the example. And what excites me about it is that there is a possibility for this to, it's a good idea for growing the economy. There are many technologies and options available to reduce our emissions and to generate energy using low carbon means. And I think we missed the boat a bit with the renewables, with solar and wind, and we're now buying those things largely from other countries. So if we can get to the front of these technologies, then I think it can actually be good for our economic prosperity as well.
That's good. Now, there's a couple of comments from Mike Miniter. I don't know if you want to unmute and say something, Mike.
Not really. I was just responding to some of the chat, and not worth taking Pete's time on it.
Okay, you're happy with that. That's grand. Okay. There's a lot of chat here about how we cook, different types of cooking appliances in homes.
Yeah. Okay. So like any other form of, if we're using gas, that's a fossil fuel. It's a lot better than oil. Probably the worst thing you can have is an oil-fired Aga, but not many people have those nowadays. But gas is about emits half of the greenhouse gases that oil does. But even that is a fossil fuel. And there's been a bit of confusion, I think, deliberate confusion, by calling it natural gas. By calling it natural gas, it implies that it doesn't emit carbon dioxide, but it's a fossil fuel and emits carbon dioxide just like other things. So a better way to do it would, if you can get off gas and get on to clean electricity, and to cook with clean electricity. I've got induction rings, an electric oven. I didn't find it as easy as gas to start off with, but I got used to it. And you can get a renewable energy tariff, and then you're making sure that you're cooking environmentally.
Good. There's so many questions coming in here, absolutely loads, and they've just jumped on me, so I'm just getting back to where I was. It's awful, I've gone and lost my space there. So Lorna is asking about meat. If all meat is equivalent and grass-fed livestock is good for carbon sequestration and landscape benefits, is that correct?
Unfortunately not. Grassland is good for sequestering carbon, so there is it's good for storing carbon. There's a lot of carbon stored in grasslands, but because grasslands already contain a lot of carbon, it's difficult to get more carbon into them. So maintaining a grassland is a good thing, but just having a grassland doesn't guarantee that you're removing carbon from the atmosphere year on year, because they're already saturated just about in the carbon that they can contain. And when you look at the figures, I mean, I would like to say that grass-fed beef is better than non-grass-fed beef, because I think it's better for so many other reasons, biodiversity and animal welfare and such like. But from a greenhouse gas perspective, it's not. And that's because the emissions, ruminants emit methane, and for every day that they're alive, they emit more and more methane. So the quicker that you can get a ruminant to slaughter weight, it means that it's emitted less greenhouse gas emissions during its life. So getting an animal to slaughter weight quickly, if you're going to do that to eat meat, that is a way to reduce its lifetime emissions, and that reduces the emissions per unit of product. But that's against everything that we believe in this country. You know, we don't like to use growth hormones and antibiotics and all those things that are used in feedlot systems in the US. But it doesn't really pan out in a way that's convenient for that argument that grass-fed beef is better than industrially produced beef. The simple fact remains that we should reduce our consumption of ruminant meat, however it's produced, and that's not a popular message.
Now we've got some questions around iPad, from iPad, somebody who's actually got their name in his iPad, and it's around, unfortunately, it's around electric cars.
Yeah.
Well, they don't have a driveway, so know where to park the car outside their house, and how can they charge the car at home? It's a situation that you see replicated all over the place. Is there anything that can be done to sort of sort that out?
Yeah, it's really difficult. There's a couple of questions on cars, and I'll try and deal with them all. Electric cars. The first thing is, where do you charge them? I think there has to be sort of a much better infrastructure around the country with public charging points as well as charging at home that are available on sort of fairly low rate tariffs for charging them. So that has to be done, particularly for people who only have on-street parking. So that has to happen in the future if we're to move to all electric cars. And there was another question I saw in the chat when I got off that was to do with the doesn't it take more greenhouse gases to make an electric car than it does a petrol one? And that's true actually. If you don't recycle the materials in the batteries of an electric car, it's pretty bad for the environment if you have to go and remine all of those materials that are used in the batteries. So what you have to do is you have to make sure that you can recycle all that material and repurpose those batteries. And that really makes a big difference to the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So there are a few things that still have to be solved with the electric cars, and we've probably only got 10 years to do it. So we need to make some real rapid change. And I think the government could help by incentivizing by incentivizing that sort of infrastructure very quickly.
Sounds good. Now, I was going to ask Rachel Morris, you've got a question to ask. Would you like to unmute and ask your own question, Rachel?
You there, Rachel?
No.
Are you muted? You have to click the little microphone button in the left-hand corner, Rachel. Shall we take another one whilst Rachel sorts that out?
Yes, we'll go on. There's a lot of comments around cars and things.
Yeah.
Right, would you say that using the search engine Ecosia is an effective way to support tree planting?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, that's a search engine a bit like Google. It's called Ecosia, and every time you use the search engine to search for things, if you use Ecosia rather than Google search or Bing or something, that raises money for tree planting. So there are things like Ecosia and others that can be used for raising money for tree planting.
And we've also got a question about hydrogen vehicles. Would they be advantageous to use?
Yeah, so there's a sort of a big debate going at the moment is will transport in the long term go hydrogen or will it go batteries and electric? And I think there's still a big argument about that. We could be stuck in a Betamax VHS sort of situation where we get locked into a specific format that maybe isn't the best. I'm told that Betamax videos were better than VHS, but VHS had the majority share and they managed to squeeze Betamax out of the video market. So I think we've got a similar situation here. There's much more energy going into electric battery cars at the moment. But there are some efforts going into hydrogen. So as you know, in Aberdeen, we have a bus fleet of hydrogen-powered buses. So hydrogen is a really effective energy carrier that can be used with electric fuel cells. At the moment, it's only used in public transport because they're about £1 million a pop each bus. But those costs will come down with scale. But it could be something that we see in future. We could see a mix of electric and hydrogen vehicles, but probably it's going to come to that point where we're going to choose one infrastructure. We're either going to go for electric or we're going to go for fuel cell electric powered by hydrogen.
Thank you. Now, there's a question here from Rachel Morris. With all the natural resources Scotland has, why does Scotland and the UK not focus more on tidal and wave energy generation?
Yeah, there have been some useful demonstration projects. We could certainly do that. Looking at the unit costs at the moment, offshore wind is running towards the front. Nobody thought that it was going to be competitive 10 years ago. Onshore wind was much cheaper and offshore wind was regarded as much too expensive. But that looks to be the front runner. I don't think that we should put all our eggs in one basket at the moment because these technologies, they do change. You know, we wouldn't have said 10 years ago that offshore wind was going to become so competitive, but it did, and the unit costs of solar power have come down greatly. So I think we should still be investing in demonstration projects. There's that project in Orkney in the Iron Hallow Sound for a tidal, and there are some other wave demonstrators around the country. And we need to keep investing in those and testing them, because they may prove to be more efficient in the future than some of those that we're using at the minute. My current money would be on offshore wind, particularly with the availability of floating wind. Now that the turbines can be offshore, that allows you to move those turbines away from the coastal shelf and into the deeper ocean, and that gives us a great potential to generate a lot of electricity on those floating platforms.
That's amazing. Now, we've got a question from Hannah Darnell about peatland restoration funding. She says, it's just been announced. What will be the benefit of that peatland funding?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of peatlands in Scotland, and quite a few of them are degraded. And when you degrade a peatland, what you've got there is 500 to 1,000 years worth, and maybe even longer than that for some peatlands, of carbon that's built up in the peatlands. So peatlands are very deep, as you know, and about quite a large percentage of that peat is carbon. It's carbon based. So when you start to degrade those peatlands, you start to lose that. You drain them or you dry them out. You lose the carbon from those peatlands, and that's lost to the atmosphere as CO2. And you can be losing up to 30 tons of carbon dioxide per year just from a hectare of peatland when it's degraded. So it's important that we restore those peatlands, and that's mainly to do with re-wetting them. So blocking up the grips, blocking up the drainage channels to allow them to re-wet, and then that stops the oxidation of the peatlands, and we stop losing that carbon to the atmosphere. And eventually we can convert those degraded peatlands into carbon sinks. So as they grew over the last 500,000 years, and they've got deeper and deeper and thicker, that's locking up carbon. And we want to get those peatlands back into that condition where they're absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere rather than emitting it to the atmosphere.
Sounds good. Now, David Bethune, you've got a comment here. Do you want to unmute and speak yourself about it?
Not really, but I was just commenting. Peter was saying about both UK and Scottish governments setting good targets, but they don't really seem to have much clue about a plan of how to achieve those targets. I was struck reading stuff by the Commonweal recently, where they've got a kind of worked out plan. I don't know how realistic it is, but it's saying these are the kind of big things we could do. It's a lot about infrastructure, and government's investing a lot in heat systems for towns and cities and all sorts of things. It's worth reading if you can get hold of that. But I'd be interested to hear if Pete's nodding there, so he's obviously knows about this and will have comments on it, I'm sure.
So there's a gap between what we promise to do and what we aim to do and what we think we can do. The government does actually have some pathway documents to net zero, and every year since the Climate Change Act in 2009, it's published 5-yearly plans to what we'll do next to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The problem is we tend to do those that are easy and that don't upset anybody at the beginning. They're called the low-hanging fruit, and we're getting to the position where we've picked almost all the low-hanging fruit already. Things like insulating homes, subsidising public transport in various places, all those sorts of things that everybody agrees with and everybody likes. We're now getting into the territory where we've picked all the low-hanging fruit and we have to start to go for some of the more difficult ones. But looking out to 2045, when our net zero target is, we've still got some wish and a prayer things in there. So that we're hoping peatland restoration will deliver so many kilotons, renewable energy will completely decarbonise the electricity grid, we'll maybe have hydrogen and electric cars and all those sorts of things. So all of those things need to be incentivised. we can put things in place now to try to put us in the position where we can deliver those through the 2030s and the 2040s. But it's a mammoth task. We can't get away from that. It's going to be extremely difficult. But I think it's great that we've got the targets, and it's great that we're trying to look into how we meet those. And it starts to affect some of the things. The Committee on Climate Change tries to set those targets for the government. That's an independent committee. It tries to set those, and it's starting to talk about things like, dietary change has to happen, for example, and that affects individual people's lives. And not everybody likes to be told, I shouldn't be eating this, or I should be eating that, or whatever. So it starts to have some impact, and then it's going to be difficult.
I think we've kind of more or less, covered most of the questions, unless anybody's got any other sort of last minute questions. I know there's one from here, from John, about asking about atmospheric heat extractors. Yeah,
atmospheric heat extractors are, it's a bit, an air source heat pump is like that. So the example that I showed that we got at our house is a ground source heat pump. So that takes heat out of the ground. But there are a few others in the village, and they're more common now than the ground source ones. You have a big sort of thing that looks like an air conditioner on the outside of your house. And it takes, it's a heat exchanger just in the same way as a fridge is, or as a ground source heat pump. It takes heat out of the air outside, and the heat exchanger then puts that into your radiators to do your domestic heating. The thing about the temperature under the ground is it stays fairly constant all year round, about 9 degrees. It never gets very hot and it never gets very cold. And air source heat pumps are much less efficient if we're sitting in the middle of the winter and it's -20 outside. Then you're asking it to work really hard to extract heat from the atmosphere then. So it's a bit less efficient in those situations.
That's great. I think no other questions popped into the box, so I think...
Can I have a quick word? Virginia Bell.
Yes, of course.
Can I just say to Pete, thanks for the list of things we can do. They're really good. But I think you should be a bit more definite about it. People can listen to you or just ignore you, but you have to tell us what we have to do if we want to make a difference. So, fly less, not at all. Just say don't fly. Eat less meat and dairy. Say go vegan. By everything else seems, pretty good. Take public transport, yeah, but be more definite. And people don't have to do it. They've got their own conscience. The law allows them to do what they want, practically. So, but I think we should say definitely what needs to be done to make a difference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Virginia. That's a fair point. I tend to not to tell people what to do. I try to present the science so that you can decide yourselves. I would be delighted if you went to people and told them what to do. I think people sometimes react badly to a scientist telling them what to do. I'd rather present the evidence and let you make up your own mind. But that's a good point.
Barry and Castlemark here. Can I come in with one thing? I've understood carbon footprint for nearly 30 years, but I've never found it useful to explain environmental issues. The ton of CO2, gas as weight, is just not understood by anybody without an environmental, scientific or engineering background. And sometimes we use languages which for a lot of people is just meaningless.
Yeah, it's difficult to express it in other ways. We tend to express it in tons of CO2, but you're right, really what we need to translate that into is the effect on climate change, but you can only really do that at the global level. So we can say this many million tons of CO2 will cause 1 degree of warming. So that's what we can do. But when we're talking at the individual level, we have to talk about sort of individual levels of CO2, and that can't be translated into 0.001 of a degree or something. So I agree that there is a communication issue, and as scientists we have to try and make that as accessible as possible. But I agree it's a problem.
Thank you so much for that. Are there any other questions? No. Can I just say thank you so much, Professor Pete Smith, for what you've done tonight for us for this talk. It's been absolutely fascinating. It's been lots and lots of things for us to go away and think about. And just great ideas in the midst of all of this as well. Lots to do. So thank you so much for this.
Delighted to talk to you. Thanks very much for having me here.
Absolutely delighted to have you. And I'm delighted that Queen's Cross Church and also Climate Week Northeast asked us to help host this tonight. So really big thank you to them as well for this, because otherwise this would have happened in Aberdeen and most of us wouldn't have had a chance to necessarily come along. So we're delighted, absolutely delighted. Can I just say we've got an event coming up on the 11th of August, which is going to be Adrian Shaw of Church of Scotland. He's the Climate Change Officer for Church of Scotland, and David Coleman, who's our Eco Chaplain with Eco Congregation Scotland. And the two of them are just going to piggyback on the back of your talk, Professor Pete. I hope you don't mind, but they're going to talk with a little bit more Christian perspective on this as well. So here we are. Stephen's showing you the poster for this.
Great, good. All power to your elbow.
Okay.
If you can make a change, brilliant.
So anybody who's here tonight would really like to invite you along to this. Please register for it in the same way you registered for tonight. If you go to our website, it's on the events page. It will also be in newsletters to come as well. We will keep prodding you. Those of us that can will be prodding you to remind you about this, and hopefully we will see you all there on the 11th of August. But for now, a big thank you, and I think a big round of applause from everybody. So thank you so much for coming along tonight. And I just wish you all a good night.
Bye, everyone.